Karl Korsch's Revolutionary Marxism by Douglas Kellner. Karl Korsch is being increasingly recognized as one of the most interesting, neglected, and relevant political theorists of the century. Korsch's early works contain reflections on workers' control and industrial democracy, focusing on the theme of the socialization of society. Korsch's essays on the transition to socialism and the critique of both social democratic reformism and Soviet state socialism remain provocative contributions. He was one of the first to criticize the repressive turn of the Soviet Union under Stalin and develop a sharp critique of authoritarian communism. He also evolved a critique of Leninism, which he believed had become a fetter on the working class movement that had to be removed to make possible a new era of revolution. Korsch was one of the most original and interesting proponents of revolutionary Marxism, and his analysis of the, quote, crisis of Marxism, end quote, contains a challenging critique of the Marxian political theory and theory of revolution. Korsch was also an early opponent of Nazism and developed a theory of fascism and counter-revolution on a worldwide scale to explain the defeats of the working class movement and their failure to follow the Marxian scenario. At the same time, he attempted to discover and elucidate other models of social change in syndicalism and anarcho-communism, and he studied the Paris Commune, the Russian Soviets, and the Spanish collectives as alternative forms of industrial and agricultural organization. Further, Korsch was one of the first Western theorists to call attention to the development of the so-called Third World, which he perceived might be a locale for the sort of social revolution that had failed to materialize in Europe and America. Korsch's works provide a privileged perspective through which to view and interpret the process of revolution and counter-revolution that has constituted the political dynamic of our beleaguered century. For Korsch was both an impassioned participant in the political struggles in Germany during the Weimar Republic and an illuminating interpreter of a fateful stretch of modern history. Korsch's writings provide an attempt to grasp his age and thought, to get a hold on historical reality through theory. Moreover, Korsch's theory was always geared towards political practice, towards showing the possibilities of and obstacles to radical social change. Hence, his work provides a paradigm of the theorist of practice, of the political theoretical activist. Although the triumph of Nazism forced Korsch into an American exile that cut him off from participating in the central political events of the day, he continued to reflect upon and interpret the major movements of history. His essays in the 1930s and 1940s provide penetrating insights into the movements of contemporary history and brilliant critiques of theories, which he felt offered a distorted and ideological picture of current history. Korsch's interaction with his historical environment requires a detailed reconstruction of the historical events to which his writings were a response and an expression in order to provide the proper context to understand his work. In a 1954 review of a Bakunin anthology, Korsch complained, quote, "Unfortunately, Bakunin's writings do not appear here in close connection with the historical conditions and concrete actions which entered into every theoretical concept of Bakunin. Without them, the living body of his thought and action is transformed into a purely ideological system," end quote. The same holds for Korsch. My introduction will attempt to elucidate the, quote, close connection with the historical conditions and concrete action which entered into every theoretical concept, end quote, of Korsch, and to bring to life his, quote, thought and action, end quote. Korsch's road to Marxian socialism. Little is known of Korsch's early life. He was born on August 15, 1886 in Todstedt, Germany, a small village southeast of Hamburg. Korsch was one of 6 children in a middle-class family. The father rose from secretary in a city hall bureau to vice president of a bank. He was well educated and had unfulfilled intellectual ambitions that were to be realized in an unexpected way by his son Karl. The mother, on the other hand, was not at all intellectual and was said to have maintained a rather untidy appearance and household. His wife, Hedda Korsch's, quote, memories contain the most detailed information on Korsch's family. Quote, Korsch came from a medium middle-class background. His father had been through secondary school and had taken the Abitur and possessed great intellectual ambition. He was very interested in philosophy and wrote on an enormous unpublished volume on the development of Leibniz's theories of monads. He tried to put the whole of the cosmos into this philosophical system. It was his life's work and purely theoretical. The family came from East Prussia from a farming background, but he wanted something more urban and intellectual. Soon after, he married Teresa Rajkowski, Korsch's mother. They moved to Tadstedt. The father wanted to be closer to Western culture, and he disliked the agricultural Junker environment in which they lived, because, although the Korsch family themselves had only a modest-sized farm, the big estates were all around them, and his father had no interest in agriculture. His mother was totally unconcerned with intellectual matters and never read a thing. She was pretty and extremely temperamental. She cooked well, and she was in a good humor, burnt everything when she was angry. She was terribly untidy, and if there is one reason why Karl was so tidy, it was because of his mother. End quote. The family moved to Meiningen in the Thuringian region when Karl was 11 to provide better educational opportunities for the children. Karl entered the local school gymnasium and did well in his studies. When Korsch was 18, he moved into an abandoned garden house where he read German literature and Kant, fleeing into nature and a higher aesthetic philosophical world to escape from bourgeois reality. Typically, behavior of German youth fed up with their surroundings and in search of something more. Michael Buckmiller, Korsch's biographer, suggests that Korsch began to put in question and oppose the society around him. Quote, his oppositional stance to his parents and school grew quickly as he increasingly experienced the contradiction between beautiful-sounding phrases and the harsh, petty bourgeois reality which surrounded him. The teachers who hammered with a Prussian cane the elevated moral values of German culture into the pupils' youthful heads, and who were frequently themselves rather pathetic alcoholics. His father, who in his leisure wrote lofty studies in natural philosophy on Leibniz's theory of monads, and who tried to lead a harmonious and healthy life guided by science, while in practice he led a self-dominating authoritarian regime and frequently beat his children. End quote. In 1906 and 1907, Korsch studied successively at Munich, Geneva, and Berlin to gain a broad foundation in philosophy and the humanities as background for his studies in law. Korsch entered the University of Vienna in 1908, where he worked on a law degree and engaged in student politics. He joined a student group, Freie Studenten, which militated for a democratization and humanization of the university. Korsch was one of its most active members. He became editor of the student newspaper and organized lectures featuring socialist speakers such as Edward Bernstein and Karl Liebknecht. The students arranged contacts with workers in the nearby Zeiss optical factory, which was presented as a model factory that shared profits with the workers, instituted workers' democracy, heavily financed the university, and built a culture center with lecture and theater rooms. Korsch published many articles in the student newspaper and actively participated in debates and lectures. On a lecture tour, he met Hedda Gagliardi, whom he was to marry in 1913. Korsch graduated from the Jena Law School, summa cum laude, supparato, in 1911. During this period, Korsch became attracted to socialism through his activities in the Freie Studenten group. His contact with local socialists and social reformers in the Zeiss optical factory, and his study of socialist literature Korsch reports, quote, "He was also a convinced socialist by the time of his last year in school. He looked around to see if there were any socialists among his schoolmates, but he did not find any. He read a lot. I do not know when he first read Marx, but I am inclined to think it was at school, because when he was a student he was an outspoken socialist by conviction, although not a member of any organization." End quote. The young Korsch had thus progressed from an attitude of withdrawal from and individualistic opposition to German society to a stance of reformist political activism. Like many intellectuals, he was attracted to socialism, but he saw socialism mainly as an ideal human society and thus criticized the Social Democrats, who in his view only represented particular interests, the working class, and thus did not embrace the, quote, whole future of the German nation, end quote. Nonetheless, he supported the practice of the Social Democrats who, quote, through social political reforms would introduce bearable conditions, end quote. Socialism was indeed necessary in Korsch's view because the, quote, capacity for culture, end quote, of a nation, quote, depended upon whether it succeeded in eliminating a system of unlimited exploitation and domination by violence, end quote. The ideal of socialism for Korsch at this stage was not to be realized through parliamentary politics or trade union activity, but through educating broad segments of the public to progressive ideas and the ideals of socialism. Korsch had thus overcome the romantic individualist tendencies of many German youth, but still had a highly idealistic vision of social change that was as much influenced by Kant as Marx. Drinky poo. In 1912, Karl and Heda went to England, where he received a grant to translate and write a commentary on a legal text of Sir Ernest Schuster. The Korsches soon joined the Fabian Society and became enthusiastic participants in its young people's group. Korsch published many articles on the Fabian activities and his experiences in England in the journal Die Tat, the German journal Die Tat. Korsch was becoming an increasingly convinced advocate of socialism, and in an interesting article in 1912 he turned to a subject that was to be a lifelong concern, the search for, quote, the socialist formula for the organization of a people's economy, end quote. Korsch complained that the socialists had not yet found, quote, an adequate formula for the construction and organization of a people's economy, end quote, that went beyond the demand for the, quote, socialization of the means of production, end quote. Already Korsch was criticizing the, quote, leading dogmas of Marxism, end quote, and searching for practical viable plans to carry through and realize socialism. He was sympathetic to Fabian proposals to gain public control of industry and their detailed plans to socialize society. Korsch believed that the Fabians', quote, marvelous undertaking, end quote, combined, quote, observation, experiment, theoretical study, fantasy, and the power of judgment, end quote. He urged German socialists to develop similar detailed plans to socialize German society. Later he was to suggest that a Fabian society be developed in Germany and may have been instrumental in persuading his student and friend, Felix Weil, to finance the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, which might have been modeled on the, quote, Fabian Research Department, end quote. Interestingly, the qualities that Korsch praised in the Fabians were to become distinctive features of his own work. He praised the Fabians for their, quote, sharp critique of the existing society and will to reform the future, end quote. Korsch also approved of their, quote, utopian impatience, quote, knowledge of reality, and their, quote, propensity towards the simple and the practical, end quote. Korsch held the Fabians to be model democratic socialists and agreed with their educational goals, their effort to create socialist consciousness, and their, quote, propaganda by the deed. Korsch believed that, quote, the Fabian society shares with German Marxism the conviction that economic and political socialism, the socialization of the means of production, will come by itself, whether or not we as individuals endorse or oppose this development. They add to this theoretical insight, however, a very important orientation of the will. They wish to awaken the practical will to the position that, with this unavoidable they wish to awaken the practical will to the position that, with this unavoidable transformation of the human economy, a human culture, the ideal of humanity will be demanded, and this ideal signifies the highest development of the human race. End quote. There's little doubt from a close reading of Korsch's early essays that he was heavily influenced by Fabian ideas, although he was soon to turn from their reformism and idealism to Marxian revolutionary materialism. The Fabian spirit of practical political activism was to long remain a feature of Korsch's theory and practice. Korsch's practical socialism. When World War I broke out in 1914, Korsch's ideals of pacifism, social and political idealism, internationalism, and rationalism came up against an increasingly brutal and barbaric reality. Korsch returned to Germany and enlisted in the army, but remained true to his pacifist convictions throughout the war, refusing to bear arms even in the heat of battle. Korsch was twice demoted for his refusal to obey orders, was wounded, and won the support of his fellow soldiers for his convictions and bravery. Quote, "It is," end quote, he wrote, quote, "as if this quantitative increase in suffering had forced us to correctly perceive, feel, and experience the simple qualitative reality for the first time," end quote. Despite his new insights into the utter barbarism of capitalism, Korsch did not fall into nihilistic pessimism and refused to surrender his ideals of a humanistic social order. Quote, "The simple difference today from our earlier position is that we do not yet feel satisfied with the highest and deepest of our strivings." End quote. Korsch's hopes for radical social change were given a dual impetus by the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the German Revolution in 1918, the surprising collapse of the German military and the political order, and the mass uprising of sailors, soldiers, and workers in the council organizations convinced Korsch and others that the transition to socialism was on the historical agenda. Korsch's military unit was known as the, quote, Red Company, end quote, and Korsch participated in the founding of a, quote, Soldiers' Council, end quote. The abdication of the Kaiser and the collapse of the old order signified for Korsch that, quote, the presuppositions are created under which a new spirit can break into German politics that will make possible a fundamental transformation of the existing social order, end quote. In January 1919, Korsch was invited by Robert Wilbrandt to serve as an assistant in the socialist-dominated Socialization Commission, presided over by Karl Korsch. Their task was to prepare recommendations for the socialization of the coal industry. Korsch concentrated his energies at this time on working out a more general theory of socialization that would provide an adequate concept of socialism. In this situation, where it seemed that socialization was a real, indeed imminent possibility in Germany, Korsch wrote a brochure, quote, called "What is Socialization?" An immediate and practical urgency informs this essay, which was concerned with the burning question of the day: how can Germany be reconstituted on a socialist basis? Korsch was appalled at the lack of a socialist theory on these immensely practical and concrete questions. What is a socialist society? How does one organize the economy on socialist principles? What does socialization involve beyond nationalization of the means of production? Social democrats such as Kautsky and Bernstein, as well as the Spartacus League, had neglected such questions, thus manifesting in Korsch's view, quote, and a, quote, incomprehensible backwardness of socialist theory in regard to the problem of practical realization, end quote. Korsch intended his work to provide a, quote, transitional program, end quote, through which a system of, quote, workers' councils, end quote, would begin the construction of socialism. Thus, quote, what is socialization, end quote, was intended to fill a gap in socialist theory and to address itself to the most important practical issue of the day. To those who think it was, quote, utopian or, quote, idealistic to accept a transition to socialism in Germany at the time, let us cite an account by E.H. Carr, which indicates that socialist revolution was widely perceived to be a real possibility. Quote, never had the call to the world revolution as the staple of Soviet foreign policy seemed more clearly justified by its fruits. While the final blow laid Germany low had been struck by others, there is evidence, which no Bolshevik was likely to overlook or underestimate, of the part played by Bolshevik propaganda in demoralizing the German armies. The civil population was in revolt against the horrors and privations of the war. The monarchy had fallen without a blow amid general execration. Workers' and soldiers' councils on the Soviet pattern had been formed all over Germany, and the Berlin Council had created the counterpart of a Council of People's Commissars. Germany had entered its Kerensky period. It seemed inconceivable that, under the stimulus of Russian example and Russian encouragement, the parallel of the Russian Revolution would not be followed to the end. When Radek reached Berlin in December 1918, he had the impression that, quote, 9/10 of the workers are taking part in struggle against the government, end quote. Other observers took much the same view, but then and for more than 2 years after, the imminence of proletarian revolution in Germany continued to haunt many who feared it as well as the Bolsheviks who hoped for it. End quote. E.H. Carr. In a series of articles in the early 1920s, Korsch grappled with the central problems of socialization and confronted issues that were ignored or suppressed by his social democratic contemporaries. The major problem in the construction of a socialist society is, he believed, that socialization involves two seemingly conflicting basic demands. First, in place of the anarchy of the, quote, free market, which Korsch sarcastically remarked is free mainly for capitalist exploiters, there will be a, quote, planned administration of production and distribution through society, end quote. Secondly, control from below. Workers' councils and industrial democracy must be inaugurated to carry out the liberation of labor and to provide a life worthy of human beings. Quote, through the immediate production of this control from below, the entire realm of production is transformed from a private affair of individual exploiters of production into the public affair of all the participants of production. Hence, the wage slaves of the old system will be transformed with a stroke into co-participating working citizens of a socialist state, end quote. In attempting to carry through these two basic demands of socialization, certain problems arise, which I shall call the contradictions of socialist socialization. On one hand, Korsch stressed the, quote, control from above, end quote. A central plan requiring a central administration to regulate the entire economy is absolutely essential to implementing socialism. On the other hand, control from below, workers' control and participation in decision-making procedures is required to realize the radical demands for the liberation of labor. Korsch formulated this contradiction in, quote, What is Socialization? In his essay, What is Socialization? As the conflict between production and consumption, between the production plants with their interests and the consuming public with their interests. This is a genuine conflict of interest, for abolishing the capitalist right to own, exploit, and control the production process simultaneously raises one, the workers' demand for division of profits among themselves and control of the labor process, and two, the consumers' demand for their share of the revenue of production and public control over the production process. The task and challenge of socialism is to achieve a harmony, a balance between these conflicting demands and interests to make possible, quote, the most far-reaching autonomy and the simultaneous insertion of all individual economic units into a planned economy, end quote. Korsch showed that syndicalist and consumer cooperative projects of organizing individual production and consumer units will come into conflict with the general public interest. Different syndicalist groups advocated that the workers take over and socialize the industries in which they work so that miners would own and control the coal mines, railroad workers, the train system, and so on. There was a widespread consumer cooperative movement in Germany, France, and England that set up alternative consumer units and businesses of all sorts. Korsch perceived that giving total autonomy to syndicalist-controlled production units and consumer cooperative units would create a series of conflicts of interest which would reproduce certain contradictions and competition of capitalism. Hence, all production and consumer units must be coordinated and regulated by public organs at a central plan. However, Korsch opposed with special vehemence state socialism and state technologies that equate socialism with the nationalization of the economy carried through by the state and controlled from above, thus failing to create workers' democracy or industrial autonomy. Korsch believed that the way to overcome these conflicting demands and interests is through instituting a system of workers' councils. Quote, socialism requires workers' councils not only because it is socialistic, but because it is also democratic, because it wants participation of all the people and wants the best for everyone, end quote. Only the councils, in Korsch's view, can fulfill Engels' demand for a total replacing of the capitalist economic order that rests on unfree labor by a, quote, socially planned regulation of production according to the needs of the totality as well as every individual, end quote. The council system would resolve the crucial problems in the construction of a socialist society. Who can use the means of production and for what purpose? What and how much will be produced? How will production be organized? How will wages and profits be divided? How will commodities be distributed? Solving these problems requires what Korsch called, quote, industrial autonomy, end quote, on the level of production and consumers' associations representing the public as a whole that will help assess public demand and social needs. Hence, a council system of production and consumer groups coordinated by a central plan, responsive to the people, will maximize production for social and individual need and maximize industrial and individual autonomy. There will be inevitable problems of coordination and conflicts of interest, but the council system will provide a system of checks and balances in which the consumer groups representing society as a whole and workers' councils representing the workers in a given plant or industry will be organized in assemblies, meetings, and discussion groups on various levels to struggle with the problems of socialist socialization. As the people develop socialist consciousness, there will be increasing cooperation and harmony between the various councils, and it will be seen that the central plan and industrial autonomy, control from above and control from below, consumers' associations and workers' councils provide complementary organs of socialist democracy. Korsch's council system concept therefore contains a critique of both, quote, state socialism that attempted to implement socialism from above and from syndicalism that wishes to make the individual production units the sole organ of power, in which the workers will own, control, and appropriate the profits for themselves. For whereas the first concept, by which the state owns everything, would be a form of state capitalism, the program of syndicalism, quote, the mines to the miners, the railroads to the railway workers, will be a form of production capitalism. Against these conceptions, Korsch urges, quote, pure community property for the totality of producers and consumers, end quote, to be administered by a council system. The weakness of Korsch's theory of socialization lies in the political question of how this program is to be practically implemented. The difficulties are readily apparent in the last section of What is Socialization? Significantly, what should we do? Educating for Socialism. The last page contains the only discussion of the political means through which socialization is to be carried out. Korsch projected 1. Political action, through state legislation and municipal ordinances. 2. Developing cooperatives. 3. Economic action of the working class through collective bargaining, co-participation in management, and the transformation of individual ownership through class struggle. Korsch concluded, quote, the logical continuance of these latter means of struggle is, in times of revolutionary fervor, the struggle to remove the capitalist enterpriser from control over the production process and to place him under the control of the totality of plant participants. Today this struggle is being fought out in many individual plants according to the program of the Spartacus League. This last means holds no terror for those who affirm the ideal of socialism. It is not a means of socialization to be condemned on the basis of some kind of moral precept, not any more than political revolution is a morally objectionable means of political emancipation, end quote. A contradiction emerges here between the sort of political action through parliamentary decree and municipal ordinance urged by the reformist social democrats and the revolutionary struggles urged by the Spartacus League. Korsch was not able to smooth over the contradictions between legal and illegal action, reformist political measures, and revolutionary syndicalist labor struggles, between the parliamentary program of the Social Democrats and the Radical Workers' Council's concept put forth by the Spartacus League and other leftist groups. Korsch didn't really take a stand with one side or another in, quote, in his essay, What is Socialization? And his other early writings on socialization, and thus could not at this point envisage any concrete and practical political or economic strategy which would bring about the socialization process he so brilliantly outlined. It should be noted that Korsch's concept of socialization is formulated as a, quote, transitional program, or what Marx called the first stage of socialism. Korsch uses the term, quote, first phase of social or communal economy in several places in what is socialization. Hence, Korsch recognizes that in the first phase of socialization, quote, private self-interest and even aspects of a, quote, market economy will be operative, and thus proposes, quote, differentiated compensation for varying achievement, end quote. There are, moreover, some remnants of Fabian elitism and perhaps a bourgeois production profit syndrome in some sections which urge that socialization utilize private interest, quote, as a motivation for the most profitable and prolific production possible, even on a still greater scale of production, end quote, that speak of, quote, resurrecting the capitalist spirit, end quote, as, quote, worker capitalism, end quote, after its elimination as, quote, owner capitalism, end quote, and that, quote, from Bernard Shaw to the effect that, quote, the talented intellectual worker will be the last exploiter of society, end quote. But Korsch quickly adds, quote, only gradually in autonomous production, decontaminated by the cessation of the class struggle between the capitalist haves and the proletarian have-nots, will that sense of community develop, which is the prerequisite for the establishment of the second and higher phase of social economy, in which the working power of every individual, just as the material means of production will be community property, whereby every individual contributes to social production according to their ability, and in turn participates in the profits of communal production according to need, end quote. Korsch concludes by stressing that the development of socialist consciousness, quote, requires a, quote, Korsch concludes by stressing that the development of socialist consciousness requires, quote, a series of cultural and political measures which can be summarized by the term socialization of education, end quote. In a 1919 article, Die Politik im neuen Deutschland, Korsch argues that, quote, socialization of the economy and socialization of education are, in fact, only two sides of the same process of transition from a private capitalist to a communal socialist economy. The transition itself is not important only and primarily for questions of production and consumption of material goods, but it is at the same time a cultural and spiritual affair of immense import, end quote. Korsch had been involved with educational reform both as a student and in England, where he wrote several articles on education. Korsch now postulated a new socialist educational system grounded in an Einheitsschule, where education, Bildung, quote, will be transferred from the privilege of a favored class into a communal good, social property of the totality, end quote. Not only would education be extended to all classes in this conception, but the very nature and content of education would change to produce socialist consciousness. Quote, the sort of school which wants to prepare the path for an evolving socialist community economy must already develop in itself the spirit of the new economic order, end quote. Above all, Korsch wanted, quote, to combine education and material production to abolish the distinction between mental and material labor, end quote. This, in effect, would abolish intellectuals as a separate class and would, as Gramsci envisioned, make every worker an intellectual in the sense that they would share in the general level of culture. Moreover, education would be more closely connected with industry and productivity. Quote, on one hand, in all cases, education of the older students in the higher classes would be connected with a limited amount of real material productive labor in industry and agriculture, while on the other hand, even after one passed through a school or college, there would still be accessible to the workers a continuing further education, end quote. Korsch also envisaged progressive education modeled on the Freie Schulgemeinde, where his wife had once taught, which would introduce coeducation, non-hierarchical, comradely relations between students and teachers, and would thus provide an organization of education parallel to the Workers' Council's organization of industry. Quote, the free schools, are aiming at autonomous education and must already be models in the present that realize in a pure form that which the, quote, free economic organization, end quote, of a distant future can first universally become places of work in which necessary labor, serving the common good, will be performed out of love of the subject matter and out of devotion to the community, end quote. The more immediate pressing problem for intellectuals was, Korsch believed, to convince the people of the necessity now for socialism and to combat reactionary anti-socialist ideology. Korsch postulated the need to develop a, quote, new spirit of German politics, end quote, through rejecting the, quote, hateful militarism, end quote, of the old Germany and cultivating a new spirit of freedom. This new all-pervasive freedom could only be created through a socialist reconstruction of the economy and education to increase the realm of autonomy in all areas of life. Korsch is taking the position here that he would reiterate in his 1930 reflections on Marxism and philosophy. Quote, socialism, both in its ends and in its means, is a struggle to realize freedom, end quote. Korsch saw the demand for socialism as a task for, quote, practical idealism, end quote, and talked in Kantian terms of a, quote, duty to construct socialism. Quote, the duty towards socialization, towards the realization of socialism, stands before all other duties in Germany. It is identical with the duty to love your neighbor, identical with the duty of self-preservation. The historical task of practical socialism is to inexorably demand its fulfillment, to marshal together all spiritual powers in resolute action, end quote. Korsch called this theory at the time, quote, practical socialism, which he defined as a third way between a purely intellectual socialism, conceived of as, quote, pure science, end quote, and the reformist socialist politics that eschews theory. Practical socialism combines theory and practice in a dialectical unity. Practical socialism rejects the view that socialism automatically proceeds from economic development as a necessary and inevitable process and stresses, quote, conscious human activity, Marx's, quote, revolutionary praxis. It holds that the presupposition, indeed the making possible, of socialist construction cannot dispense with a faith that moves mountains, a will to transform the world, and creative human activity, end quote. Korsch is stressing here the necessity of cultivating the subjective factors of revolutionary consciousness to make possible socialist revolution, a theme to which he will often return. The practical socialist should recognize that, quote, capitalism is impossible in the future, and that socialism does not come about by itself. Thus the practical socialist will direct all his consciousness and endeavor, and put into motion all the powers of his thought and all the passion of his will, to begin and carry through socialist construction before it is too late, end quote. In this way, the practical socialist will adhere to, quote, a socialism in which science, faith, and readiness for socialist action will be molded together in an inextricable unity, and that is practical socialism, end quote. Korsch's writings on socialization represent a transitional phase between his earlier social democratic Fabian reformism and his move to Marxian revolutionary materialism. Indeed, it appears that at the time of writing What is Socialization, Marx had but a simplistic understanding of the Marxian critique of political economy. With characteristic energy and enthusiasm, Korsch delved into an intense study of Marx in the early 1920s and praised the, quote, Faustian knowledge of Marx, end quote, whom Korsch characterized as, quote, that, quote, Copernican-like founder, whom he characterized, Jesus Christ. I feel like I have, like, this weird fucking dyslexic thing where I always want to read the thing before the thing that's there. Like, if something says X and Y, for some reason I want to say Y and X. Not want to, but just impulsively do. So I put the quotation marks in the wrong places. With characteristic energy and enthusiasm, Korsch delved into an intense study of Marx in the early 1920s and praised the, quote, Faustian knowledge of Marx, end quote, whom Korsch characterized as that, quote, Copernican-like founder of the science of political economy, end quote. Korsch had now truly begun his lifelong relationship with Marxism that would involve him in a series of fateful events. As Korsch moved towards revolutionary Marxism, he developed a polemic against social democratic reformism, which he believed had failed to perceive the primacy of production in the Marxian theory, that radical change must begin with the transformation of the relations of production, and that for Marx, quote, a fundamental restructuring of the social relations of distribution is simply impossible without a restructuring of the relations of production, which are the foundation of all social relations, end quote. Hence, quote, every serious social political reform, every better and more just distribution of goods within a basically capitalistically organized economy is bound by insurpassable limits, end quote. Moreover, Korsch came to believe that from a genuinely Marxist standpoint, socialization could not come about, quote, through pure thought and the ideological will of talented social technicians, end quote, but rather only through revolutionary struggle. Here Korsch decisively moves away from his earlier Fabianism. Later Korsch criticized as, quote, socialization opium, end quote, the projects of Hilford and Kautsky and others who wanted to leave socialization to functionaries of the social democratic government. Korsch concluded, quote, only when from scientific knowledge we have deeply grasped the impossibility, the completely illusory character of that seemingly so, quote, realistic connection of capitalist production policy with a socialistic distribution policy can we become practical socialists. In the early 1920s, Korsch moved toward a revolutionary socialist position. This is clear in the Fundamentals of Socialization, translated in this anthology, which Rusconi describes as, quote, the most important of this period, end quote, the first blueprint of Korsch's Marxism, end quote. In this article, Korsch suggests that the working class movement has failed, quote, to grasp the essentials of scientific socialism in the specific sense laid down by Marx and Engels, end quote. The primacy of revolutionary practice, quote, the identity of objectifying knowledge and activity, end quote, and the stress on revolutionary will, revolutionary fantasy, and revolutionary faith. The deficiency of these subjective conditions of revolution and the lack of a decisive activist thrust in the working class movement had momentous political implications. In explaining the failure to carry through a resolute and thoroughgoing transition to socialism in the November Revolution, Korsch wrote, quote, it is by no means to be traced back to purely external coincidences that in the enormously fateful months after November 1918, as the political power organization of the bourgeoisie collapsed and nothing external stood in the way of the transition from capitalism to socialism, the great hour nonetheless had to slip by unseized because the socio-psychological presuppositions for its utilization were sorely lacking. A decisive belief in the immediate capacity for realization of the socialistic economic system, which could have carried the masses onward, was nowhere to be found, nor was there a clear knowledge of the nature of the first steps to be carried out, end quote. The deficit in the subjective conditions of revolution is at least in part attributed to, quote, a backwardness of socialist theory. For Korsch, an important and neglected component of Marxism is what he calls concepts of realization, which anticipate a new reality and posit historical alternatives. The future-oriented and practice-oriented thrust of Korsch's conception is strikingly expressed in the following passage, quote, the concepts of realization arise out of a full knowledge of the economic and psychological totality and its perceivable tendencies of development. Through the concepts, science anticipates individual emerging social reality. Sorry, I have to repeat this whole thing. I spaced out. Quote, the concepts of realization arise out of a full knowledge of the economic and psychological totality and its perceivable tendencies of development. Through the concepts, science anticipates the individual emerging social reality. Through their conscious anticipation of the coming, these concepts also posit one of the realities through which the creative transformation from the old to the new forms of social and individual being can alone be accomplished. Scientific knowledge can, of course, take this particular form only in the creative fantasy of a revolutionary who has already previously carried out the transformation from the old to the new in his thought. and from the fact that Kautsky and all of those who stand close to him do not possess such creative, faithful revolutionary fantasy, we can explain their all too long denial of practical, future-oriented thoughts. From this lack of revolutionary fantasy, we may also explain the ghostliness of their programs of action and plans for socialization." End quote. In addition to Korsch's emphasis on the unity of revolutionary theory and practice and the importance of the subjective conditions of revolution, he stressed the need for revolutionary theory to concern itself with the, quote, "forms of socialist construction," end quote. Korsch then discussed three concepts of socialization dominant at the time that were embedded in three complexes. Korsch then discussed three concepts of socialization dominant at the time that were embedded in three complexes of, quote, "economic historical realities," end quote, and actual socialization plans. He argued that the superior concept of socialization is the one that posits the workers' councils as the authentic organ of socialism. Let us examine this position that equates socialization with workers' councils, which defines the core of Korsch's political conception in more detail. Korsch and the Workers' Councils movement. Korsch's earlier, somewhat idealist and moralistic concept of socialism was to give weight to an increasingly tough-minded concept of practical socialism under the twofold impact of his participation in the rise and decline of the Workers' Council movement and his intensive study of Marx. During World War I, workers' councils spontaneously emerged in Germany from shop stewards' committees and strike committees, much as the Soviets had emerged from militant labor political economic activity in Russia in 1905 and 1917. The German unions and political parties were hampered in their activities both by irresolute bureaucratic leaders and by special laws that declared a state of siege, and thus prohibited militant activity. Groups of workers' councils emerged as alternative organs of protest and action against the war and against the deteriorating economic, political, social situation, thus creating new forms of political struggle. In Berlin, in June 1916, 55,000 workers struck to protest the war, led by strike committees that were the seeds of the workers' councils. These groups continued to develop and mushroom throughout Germany. In a general strike in April 1917, 300,000 workers participated, and in a general strike in January and February 1918, over 500,000 workers participated, mobilized by the councils. Throughout 1918, the military and economic political situation in Germany rapidly deteriorated, and a series of strikes and military insurrections culminated in the November uprisings in Berlin that forced the Kaiser to abdicate. These events awakened sharp hopes and fervent militancy for a socialist workers' republic. In this fluid and explosive situation, Korsch first supported attempts led by the Social Democrats to socialize key German industries, and then was drawn irresistibly to the Workers' Councils movement. Indeed, Korsch was heavily influenced by the theorists of the council movement, and in turn contributed many articles to their journals. It is interesting to note that the Workers' Councils theorist Ernst Däumig, I think that's how you pronounce that, Ernst Däumig issued the term, quote, "practical socialism," end quote, to describe the council's movement. The following passage from Däumig is extremely Korschian in its language and concepts, and shows Korsch's deep kinship with the council's movement and its strong influence on his thought. Quote, "The council's concept is in its pure and consequential application practical socialism. It should provide the possibilities to translate through the proletariat the teaching of socialist science as propagated by socialist parties into reality. The council's organization must be constructed and extended according to these goals and tasks, and must receive their structure and completion in a council system. Since the council's organization is the child of revolutionary epochs, it will never enter fixed and complete into beautiful paragraphed phrases, but will take its external form and tactical tasks according to the process of revolutionary development and the demands of the current revolutionary situation to which it must conform. End quote. Doimig. The council's movement was at first almost unanimous in calling for the construction of a socialist republic of workers' councils and the abolition of capitalism. This radicalism in fact distinguishes the workers' councils from previous working class organizations. Two contemporary accounts stress this point. Quote, "Here lies an essential distinction between the workers' councils and previous forms of workers' organization. While the old economic and political organizations tie themselves to the conditions of the capitalist environment and the class state and receive the laws of their movement from these, the working class seek in the workers' councils new forms of means with which to posit the fully conscious task of definitely overcoming the capitalist economy and class state, and at the same time build the foundations for the construction of the new." End quote. And, quote, "One should not forget the revolutionary origin of the council's conception in order to correctly understand it. All attempts to construct a council's organization in the framework of bourgeois society and on the foundation of capitalist production will either yield a distorted concept or will be obliterated by the forward-striving tendencies of council's thought. A council's organization can only be related to proletarian socialist struggle that is determined to eliminate capitalist production and the state erected on it, even when it has a republican facade, and to put in its place socialist production and a self-administering public community." End quote. Korsch later argued that the demand for workers' councils expressed, quote, "in the first phase of the revolutionary movement in Germany, the still very unclear and confused, but nevertheless very resolute and strong will for social revolution." End quote. The tremendous appeal of the council showed that, quote, "the workers finally wanted to carry through an action an open and total break with the objectively long surpassed bourgeois conception of legality, and that every place of work is the private property of whatever owner, and that every working person is seen as an instrument of labor bought by the owner." End quote. The workers' councils were thus revolutionary organs inalterably opposed to the capitalist system. The workers' councils demanded a complete break with the old system and demanded a new socialist order. The central political question confronting the SPD leaders who nominally had taken over the reins of government and the militant workers in the councils movement who were the most powerful political force was whether a parliamentary system or a workers' council system should be constructed in Germany, or whether these organs could coexist as, quote, "dual power." End quote. Korsch did not in 1919-20 take a clear-cut stand on this issue, although he was a firm supporter of the council system. Possibly he believed, along with many other independent socialists, that dual power was possible, that the workers' councils and parliament could share state power. This was to be an illusion with grave consequences for the SPD political leaders relentlessly consolidated. This was to be an illusion with grave consequences, for the SPD political leaders relentlessly consolidated power in the central government, which they shared with the parliament, the military, the previous state functionaries, and other members of the former ruling class. Moreover, the unsuccessful Spartacus revolt, resulting in the deaths of militant radicals such as Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, as well as the violent suppression of councils governments in Bavaria, Bremen, Gotha, Halle, Leipzig, and elsewhere by government troops and the proto-fascist Freikorps, greatly weakened the revolutionary forces who wanted a council socialist republic. Further, congresses of the councils movement in December 1918 and October 1920 voted for the creation of a parliament system that would in many ways supplant the councils, and the Social Democrat-dominated parliament quickly moved to weaken the power of the councils. The Parliamentary National Assembly in February 1920 limited the power of the councils to an extreme degree and in effect destroyed the growth and impetus of the movement. It seems that not only did the radical demands of the workers' councils movement threaten the domination of the former ruling class, but it also threatened the control of the labor movement by the parties and unions. Moreover, many of the members of the councils were party or union members or leaders themselves. This caused factionalism within the councils movement by the unions and parties and created divided loyalties that weakened the movement from within. Nonetheless, the concept of workers' councils as authentic organs of socialism was not to die, and Korsch remained loyal to this concept throughout his life. Korsch continually reflected on the intoxicating rise and depressing fall of the workers' councils movement and offered an analysis of the failure of the movement to achieve its goal of constructing a socialist republic. While summarizing the recent history of the workers' councils movement, Korsch discerned three reasons for its failure. 1. The councils were co-opted and controlled by the parties and the unions rather than being autonomous organs of the workers, elected and controlled by the workers themselves for themselves. 2. The councils for the most part failed to exert real power and hence to replace or control the pre-revolutionary court and legal system, the military, the old governing bureaucracy, and other agents and institutions of the bourgeois system. Thus, the councils failed to become independent and dominant organs of people's power. Finally, 3. The councils failed to assume both political and economic power and were confused as to their own function. Because it was not clear whether the councils were primarily political or economic organs, the parliamentary bureaucracy of the SPD could attempt to limit the councils to economic activity, while the old union bureaucracy could claim the councils had primarily political functions. In this way, quote, the government and the bourgeoisie, the SPD, the unions, and other open and hidden opponents of the council system were able to play off against each other the economic and political tasks of the workers' councils, end quote. The tragic failure of the workers' councils movement was thus, in a sense, rooted in a theoretical deficit. Quote, there was little clarity over the essential tasks of the council dictatorship itself in the most well-known representatives of the Revolutionary Council's conception in Germany in the days after the November upheaval, end quote. The law in the 1921 Weimar Constitution that limited the councils to purely economic activity and that was ratified by the council's Congress itself compelled for Korsch the end of the council's system as an instrument of revolution in Germany. Korsch sadly concluded, quote, today there is no longer an independent councils movement in Germany. Parliamentism, the party, and the union system have externally gained a full victory over the revolutionary council system. Hence, only subterraneously in the consciousness of the suffering masses, beside the thoughts of revolution, smolders on the thought of the revolutionary council system, smelted together in inseparable unity with the thought of revolution. On the day of revolutionary action, the councils will again rise like the phoenix from the ashes. End quote. Korsch was returned to the concept of workers' councils as the authentic organ of socialism throughout his life. He was one of the first to develop a neo-Marxist theory of revolutionary and democratic socialism and thus provided a critique of the sort of state socialism, centralized bureaucracy, and new forms of domination that would develop in the Soviet Union. A problem in the Marxist theories of socialism dominant at the time was, Korsch believed, an over-evaluation of the role of the state in constructing socialism and de-emphasis on developing institutions that would put real power in the hands of the people. Quote, state socialism, end quote, Korsch wrote, quote, will not be socialism at all, end quote. The liberation of labor should proceed through the implementation of workers' control and should be the work of the people themselves, and not the state, the party, or any other body. Hence, quote, Only after the overcoming of the last remains of a formal democratic state ideology can the necessity of the workers' councils, RETA, for the construction of a classless and stateless socialist society be grasped in its innermost essence." End quote. The following passage well summarizes Korsch's position and shows why his concept of socialism is still of utmost relevance today. Quote, "Socialization can first be achieved in a sense adequate to the actively working and productive class, when the workers have become fully authorized participants in production on the way to direct socialization. None of the earlier socialist teachings that solely focus on the, quote, political means, end quote, of liberating the working class from capitalist exploitation can bring us the socialism that working people desire, the striving of the masses for some sort of psychic equilibrium against the immense unfreedom of individual workers in large factories under the modern relations of production in large industries cannot be satisfied through a mere change of the employer. The single productive class of active workers will not as such be freer. Their ways of life and labor will not be more worthy of a human being through replacing the bosses installed by the owners of private capital, by officials installed by the state government or a community administration. Thus, in the consciousness of a large circle of workers, the earlier socialist teaching is being put aside, which began with the slogan, 'Seize the, quote, political power,' end quote, in the state, and then decree the, quote, 'transition of the means of production to the whole public,' end quote, through legal means. Thus, essentially, in the forms of nationalization and communalization, this model is being replaced by a completely different conception of what is essential to the, quote, 'socialization,' end quote, demanded by modern socialism. One can say that today no socialist plan, no matter how it looks, will be acknowledged as satisfactory fulfillment of the idea of socialization that does not carry, in one form or another, the notion of a broadly conceived, quote, 'industrial democracy,' end quote, the concept of the direct control and administration of every branch of industry, in which every single business is managed by the community of participating workers and through organs determined by themselves. When, quote, 'socialization,' end quote, is demanded today, the word no longer merely invokes the universal and abstract demand for the transfer of means of production into the possession of the whole public. Rather, the demand for socialization today has solidified into the more concrete demand that the transfer of the means of production into public property takes place in such a way that everywhere the masses of workers themselves will receive the administration of their places of work, or at least will receive the decisive part of the control of this administration," end quote. The subsequent rise of state socialism, both in the Soviet bloc and in those countries where social democrats won state power, The subsequent rise of state socialism, both in the Soviet bloc and in those countries where social democrats won state power, showed the problems involved in the construction of a party bureaucratic apparatus which produced new forms of domination and failed to contribute to the liberation of the working class. Korsch offers an alternative to these models of socialism, an attractive democratic libertarian model, hence the great interest in Korsch's ideas today. In view of Korsch's early position on the primacy of workers' councils in the construction of socialism and his critique of state socialism, it may appear highly surprising that his turn towards Marxism and revolutionary socialism took the form of an enthusiastic embrace of Leninism and the Soviet Union as the model of socialism. Actually, Korsch's orthodox communist interlude would be a relatively brief one, from 1921 to 1926, and he would emerge from his period of fervent Leninism as one of the leading left oppositionalists who again championed the workers' councils as the authentic organs of socialism, criticizing the Leninist concept of the party and state which he had temporarily defended. On the basis of Korsch's concept of socialization rooted in workers' councils, his courageous opposition to Stalinism, and his brilliant critique of Leninism and Marxism, there has arisen a legend that Korsch was the paradigm of the left oppositionalist libertarian socialist. It has been alleged falsely, as we shall see, that Korsch had deep reservations about entering the Communist Party, and that from the beginning of his involvement in the communist movement, Korsch opposed the dominant policies of the German and Soviet communists from a left oppositionalist position, that Korsch engaged in oppositionalist activity against the Communist International by participating in a left offensive against Bolshevism at the Comintern World Congress in 1924, and finally that Korsch began in the early 1920s developing a heretical theoretical current which opposed a critical dialectical Hegelian or Western Marxism to communist Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. The true story of Karl Korsch's adventures with communism is far more complicated and convoluted than the Korsch legend would have it. In the following pages, I would like to clear away the many myths which have surrounded and occluded Korsch's theory and practice. I shall show, first, why Korsch became a Leninist and unstintingly defended the Bolshevization of the German Communist Party in his writings of 1920 to 1925. We shall then see how the myth arose that during this period Korsch was an anti-Bolshevizer, and shall see that Korsch's special version of the philosophy of praxis, which I call his, quote, revolutionary historicism, end quote, underlies both his support of Leninism and the Soviet Union and his later critical oppositional position. I shall then show how and why Korsch became a left oppositionalist and will reconstruct the progress through which he became an anti-Leninist. In my view, Korsch's contribution to radical social theory does not lie simply in being a left oppositionalist who provides a model of negation in critical theory, nor does his critique of Leninism consist in an abstract rejection of Leninist theory and practice. Rather, Korsch reveals the limits of Leninism and its failure as a model of revolution for the West by living through the Leninist experience and painfully criticizing it from within before he could, quote, cut the umbilical cord of Leninism and evolve his oppositional position. For Korsch identified with Leninism from the early 1920s to 1927, involving himself deeply in Leninist theory and practice, and then developed a critique of Leninist theory from the experience of the failure of Leninist practice in Germany and the Soviet Union. Let us now examine the strange and tragic story of Korsch's involvement with the communist movement in the 1920s.